Welcome to everyone from around the world. This is the Paris International Film Festival. I'm Chesley Heymsfield, and I'm serving as one of your humble jury members for this year's festival. I'm honored to welcome you to our exciting and informative panel, Research at the Cutting Edge, Post-COVID Fatigue. And I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Jenna, the executive director of the festival, who's an immensely talented filmmaker and a real social cause advocate. We thought a panel about the long-term implications of COVID would be relevant not only to some of the films that are in the festival, but also to the audience overall. So we're really honored today to have an amazing group joining us from the Stanford Genome Technology Center. So we've got Dr. Ami Mack, Dr. Ronald Davis, and Dr. Michael Snyder, a stellar team leading research on how viruses can alter a normally functioning human body and cause it to never fully recover. We're now witnessing a pattern around the globe where thousands of people who were infected with COVID-19 struggle to recover even after the virus clears their body. This is something that many physicians are finding perplexing and patients are really finding frustrating. So on this panel, we'll dive into unraveling a chronic complex illness known as chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME/CFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, and how it's related to what we're seeing in COVID. So we're honored to have you all here today. And let's start with Dr. Ami Mack. I'll give her a little introduction and I'll ask a series of questions for each participant. So Dr. Mack is a physician and director of translational medicine at the Stanford Genome Technology Center. Her clinical expertise are in physical medicine and rehabilitation, sports medicine, interventional pain management, musculoskeletal ultrasound, and patient relations. She's authored Musculoskeletal Ultrasound Pocket Guide and served in leadership at the Association of Academic Physiatrists, where she's national educator to medical and medical residents. So the first question for you, Dr. Mack, what is translational medicine and what do you do at the Stanford Genome Technology Center?
Well, first of all, bonjour, Patty, and thank you, Chesley, for having me on, and the rest of us. So translational medicine is the process by which we're able to connect science with and research at the bench and connect it to bring innovation to the bedside, which is in the hospital, and then concomitantly integrate the community's input into developing technologies and bringing them to the community in the fastest and most strategic way possible.
Fascinating. So with regard to ME/CFS, how are you involved in that? And from your perspective as a physician and in translational medicine, what is the illness? How would you describe it to a patient or another physician?
So ME/CFS stands for myalgic encephalomyelitis, and it's quite a mouthful, I know. And we shorten it as ME. It was also called chronic fatigue syndrome, or CFS. So that's why we call it ME/CFS now. Myalgic means muscle, or myalgia is muscle pain. Encephalo is the brain, and myelitis, myelin is the coating around the nerves. So myalgic encephalomyelitis has been a disease that has likely been around forever. And what we have found over at Stanford and in other places that have been studying this is that the disease has been, it's not uncommon, it's actually quite common. In fact, in the United States, approximately 2.5 million people probably are affected by it. And we've been studying it for quite some time at Stanford. And I'm thankful to Ron Davis and Mike Snyder for integrating me into Stanford so that I could be part of the research and what they're doing. Because 2.5 million people have it, it's been a difficult diagnosis for physicians to make because it wasn't actually even made into a diagnosis that the physicians could put down in their code if they're writing out patient notes until 2015. That's when the Institutes of Medicine in the United States made it an official disease. And so people who went to medical school prior to that and even now are not getting trained on it. And that is one of the important facts and efforts that we're trying to bring forth. So 80% of patients who have myalgic encephalomyelitis developed it prior to an infectious an infectious agent, viruses being one of them. And in our research in the past and other people's research, it turns out that about 10% of patients who have had SARS and MERS, which are also coronaviruses, just like COVID, developed long-standing symptoms that are similar to those that we see, if not identical to those that we see in ME/CFS. So when coronavirus and COVID actually came upon us in about January or February, we were very concerned because we had been studying this for so many years before. Immediately, Ron had said to me, Ami, this is going to be potentially a huge problem. If 10% of patients who have COVID right now, whether symptomatic, asymptomatic, or whatnot, end up with a chronic, long-standing, disabling disease, then what is going to happen? How are we going to manage all these people? And 75 to 80% of people are at some point homebound or bedbound. So it's extremely debilitating. People are having difficulty taking care of their families. They're having difficulty working. They're having difficulty thinking. And they're nowhere near what they used to be before they were infected. So what we decided is it was going to be very important for us to bridge the studies between long COVID, which is the long haulers or people who aren't recovering from COVID, and ME/CFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. So what some of the things that patients exhibit or symptoms are brain fog, so not being able to think clearly, having difficulty finding words, having difficulty putting their train of thought together, speaking more slowly, not recognizing, having a hard time reading, difficulty standing up for long periods of time, feeling dizzy, lightheaded, short of breath, also numbness and tingling in their hands and their feet, nausea, sometimes vomiting, maybe indigestion, a variety of symptoms, feeling too hot, feeling too cold, flu-like symptoms. And so these symptoms all put together have historically been so confusing to doctors because they're coming from all the different systems in the body. And so myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME/CFS, what we found looks just like what we're seeing in what we're hearing about in the COVID long haulers.
Amazing. Thank you for that overview. So what would you recommend to people now who've been infected with COVID and appear to not be recovering after several months or even after the virus has cleared their body? What can they do to try and find some reprieve, treatment, help from a physician, from family members, friends? What are these people to do?
So that's a really good question, Chesley, and it's a question that people ask all the time. First of all, it's important for them to go to the websites or clinical information about this disease so that they can educate themselves. What's also really important is that their family and their providers, that they give them information about where to go to learn more about this, because it's education that's really going to drive patient care. So the patient's families also, I really encourage their family and their friends to really listen to them and not say that this is something that's all in their minds, because that has happened for a very long time. And it's a devastating thing when you're someone who's suffering so greatly and the community or your friends and your families don't even acknowledge that you're ill. That experience in itself is damaging. The other thing I would really recommend is to go to our website. The Stanford Genome Technology Center has a website in which we're posting information as research is coming out, and we will be adding to that website more and more information that patients can use to find research they can be part of. And last but not least, I would certainly say the very most important thing is to not give up on themselves, to talk to the healthy people around them, friends, family, anyone that will listen, and try to educate them if they're really realizing that this is something that's happening to them. Don't let your voice as a patient be suppressed.
Wonderful, thank you. So really, if you're a person who suspects you have this right now, and you can get the support of your family, your friends, you can empower yourself to to continue through this struggle. What are your options for treatments? What can you do, or what can physicians do who see these patients? What do you usually recommend or see happen?
So oftentimes what I see happen is physicians who don't know about this, they tell patients that I wish that physicians would just say, I don't know, and leave it at that. But I think that oftentimes we're taught that we know so much and we forget that there's so much more to learn. And so I would say that there's many things that the patients can get treated with. So one of the main points in this is we are successfully treating patients with ME/CFS in those centers and clinics where the physicians understand this much better than the rest of the world. And I can certainly say I've seen people go from completely debilitated to being able to have a life again. So some of the reason for that is because there are other illnesses that have these little names that actually fit into the big picture of ME/CFS. Some of those are postural orthostatic tachycardic syndrome, or POTS. And so oftentimes cardiologists or neurologists are specialists who understand that, and not all of them. So just because one doctor doesn't know what's going on, I encourage them to go see others who may have expertise in those specific areas. Dysautonomia, that's where the nervous system isn't functioning normally. And so any of the signals that go to the rest of the body, they're misinterpreted, and it may make the entire body look as though it's not functioning normally, hence the symptoms that are everywhere and coming from all systems. Also, there's mast cell activation syndrome, otherwise known as MCAS. Mast cells are cells that are responsive for allergic responses. And so when you see someone's lips swell up after they had a bee sting or ate a brownie, that's the kind of reaction that's having. The mast cell is activated, and it can happen through the body. There's a number of other, and we have treatments for those things. And so what I recommend is finding physicians who at least can recognize certain parts of this illness, and people can read much more about it online. This is a long conversation that we would have because it's such a complex disease.
Amazing. So, Dr. Mack, if anyone from the government or any government official reached out to you or to the center to get you involved in a task force for COVID long haulers or for ME/CFS in general, is that something that you would all be willing to participate in?
Most certainly. We welcome the opportunity. Stanford is a very collaborative place. We collaborate with all of our clinicians and researchers. And the whole reason why Stanford is such a wonderful place to do research and get clinical care is because we work so closely, and everybody brings their individual expertise together. And there's a lot of new discoveries that can be found when you're taking people who are able to look at a problem from different angles. So we would encourage that collaboration.
Oh, that's wonderful. I really hope it happens. We need you on the front line. So speaking of a master discoverer, that's a good segue for Dr. Ronald Davis. So Dr. Davis is a professor of biochemistry and genetics and co-director at the Stanford Genome Technology Center. And he was named alongside Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos as one of today's 9 greatest inventors by The Atlantic. A substantial number of the major genetic advances of the past 20 years can be traced back to Davis in some way. So he's such a pioneer, and we are pleased to have him today. So Dr. Davis, how did you initially get involved with studying ME/CFS?
Well, I think the major push is that my son got sick, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. And I encouraged him to go to some of the doctors that we knew, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. And I kept insisting that he find another doctor. Somebody's got to know what's wrong. He got sick after he came back from India, and he was living in San Francisco. But it took him really a few years to find a doctor in Marin County across the bay who said that he had ME/CFS. And I had heard about that, but I thought it was a really difficult disease. I had a backpacking friend that did a lot of backpacking with in my younger days, who came down with it as well. And she didn't look sick, but she was pretty much bedbound. And it was hard to me to understand. How can you not look sick and you can't get out of bed? And then my son came down with it. And so I started to explore other doctors and what could we do about it, and realized that there were some treatments for the symptoms, but he was very severe. So I decided that I had to spend my time working on this disease. And I was running the Genome Technology Center. We had about 65 good scientists there, a whole mix of all sorts of different fields. So that helped a lot to have people face to face that knew a lot of different things. You know, engineers and chemists and geneticists and physicians and so forth, just a whole group of people. The problem with the department is that it has all the same people with the same training. So we had about 65 PhDs, but now I'm down to a total of 16 people, of scientists and technicians and so forth. And that's all I can afford. It's really difficult to fund this. When I was doing the Genome Project, I had much, much bigger funding. But I gave that all up, and I had to, and I had to focus on this. So all of the funding that I get right now comes from donations from patients and or patient families. So this is an extremely debilitating disease, and I don't think NIH takes it very seriously. They kind of say they do, but then you look at the actions and their funding levels are actually pathetic. Now, hopefully the COVID sort of disaster will change that. I put in one grant to look at long COVID. That was turned down, but that was probably too early when people didn't think that, they thought that maybe was kind of crazy. But I think now they're going to do a much bigger funding level because they put a lot of money into looking at this from Congress. So I'm optimistic now that there'll be at least some money for some researchers. I will try to get some. The Open Medicine Foundation that I got involved with Linda Tannenbaum, who is a fundraiser, and I said I would do the scientific part and put together a scientific advisory board to help in this. In fact, Mike Snyder is one of the members of that. And so these are really smart people that have agreed to help out on this problem. Several of them are at Stanford, but they also come from all over the world. And so hopefully we can do something about this disease. We have gotten a big donation to work on this. And hopefully that money will help us do an extensive evaluation. Quite a few samples are coming in to us from Sweden because they were able to get going on this sooner than we could. So I'm hoping that we'll find out. Now, I would like to add something that Ami was talking about with the patients, but another precaution for these patients. They look like they have ME/CFS. We don't know for sure. But I think it's best to assume that they do have for their own good. Because one of the problems with ME/CFS is that if you overextend or you overextend your energy envelope, let's call it that you will get worse. So a lot of doctors feel that, well, you're just, you're in bed, you just need to get out and get active again. Well, that to some extent that is probably true, but if you overdo it, you will get worse. And a lot of athletes who come down with ME/CFS always try to push through it. And they keep getting worse and worse and worse. And pretty soon they're bedbound. And in fact, my son, for example, is unable to talk. He cannot eat. He cannot drink. So we have to feed him through a tube. The tube goes into his top of his intestine. And he has a Hickman port in his chest to get fluids. And that is not an uncommon situation for this disease, for people who actually try to push through this. and it gets to be very expensive.
Well,
And
so as a note of caution, then, would you recommend that people who suspect they may have it as a result of COVID or other viral infections to take it easy, then, to not push themselves beyond their energy envelope?
yeah, try to figure out how far you can go and not get worse, and be active as much as you can. But if you do, they call it crash, where you've exceeded your envelope and you actually become very non-functional for quite some time. It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month. Many people will recover from that after a while, but that means you exceeded your envelope, and try not to do that. And so that's a very, I think it's an important thing, because people will just continue to get worse, and it'll cost them more and more money to try to maintain themselves. Suicide is very common in this disease, and it's largely, I think, because they don't have any hope. My son has been doing a lot of, he agreed to be sort of the poster child for this because he's so severe. And he says he will not commit suicide, and he wants to tell people to hang in there. That things are changing, and we just need to get more funding and more researchers involved to figure it out.
What can people do to get you that funding? The public can make immense change when they want to. So what will it take? What do you need to get all the funding you need to do your research? Because the center's done such incredible things on a shoestring budget. And so what do you need?
The best thing to do is get an NIH 5-year NIH grant, because now you know how much money you're going to have next year. The difficulty with people making donations, which is wonderful, but you can't, there's no guarantee you will get that funding next year. And many people stretch themselves a lot sometimes to donate money, and they may not have it the next year. So it's more difficult to make a planning. We really try to raise enough money to keep everybody's salary going. So far, I've been successful for the last 5 years doing that. But other possibility would be a fairly large donor to set up some sort of endowment, or a 5-year endowment, where money is given every year for 5 years. That's even a better situation. They can give it to the Open Medicine Foundation, which is a charity, or they can go on our website, and there's a donate button there, and donate it. All they have to do is specify who they want to give it to. There's a lot of good researchers out there. They're all struggling to get enough money to do the research. We really want to look at, we really want to have a lot of different people with lots of different expertise. We'd like to get people who have a really good track record, because track record is probably the best indication of how successful they will be. Mike Snyder has a fabulous track record, for example, and he's done a wonderful job as chair of the genetics department. So you look at the track record of the people, and that is how you make an evaluation for science. And that will actually help a lot for this disease.
And so you've really been sounding the alarm for quite some time, kind of banging at the door, trying to get attention for this illness. And clearly COVID may be ushering in some positive recognition for ME/CFS at this time. So when I was at a symposium with you in the past, probably about 2 years ago, you did say, in the future, and I'm quoting relatively close here, if there were to be a pandemic, there would be a large percentage of the American population that would not recover.
That's right.
So I remembered that. When I recorded you on video there, I remembered as soon as this happened, I said, oh my God, millions of people could end up getting ME/CFS now. And just my heart stopped. So is this your continuation of a warning now, really as a forecaster that you are, trying to tell people what could America look like? What could the world look like? If, as you said to me 2 years ago, if people don't die, but they're disabled, what could that mean for us?
Well, it's going to cost the country a tremendous amount because you're going to have a large number of people out of the workforce. You not only have the person who's sick, but someone often has to take care of them. And that's almost a full-time job. So many caregivers quit their job and take care of their son or daughter. And so my wife was a clinical psychologist, and she has given up her career as a clinical psychologist. She was an outstanding clinical psychologist dealing with adolescents, which are really difficult. They're good people, but they're struggling with all sorts of different issues as they're growing up, and they really need help. But she had to give it up. She still sees a few patients that she saw in the past because it's unethical really to drop people, but she's not taking on any new people. And so that's just an example. And that will happen, so everybody is who has this will probably wind up taking somebody else out of the workforce. And that has a big economic problem. 15 years ago, I wrote to the CDC saying we really need to develop a very rapid, accurate test. And it needs to cost no more than $1. And you have to get it in something like 20 minutes. And it has to be highly accurate. And we may have to develop new technology to do that. They blew me off. I said, if you had such a technology and there wasn't a pandemic, you could probably keep it out of the country for quite some time. And you could keep it out long enough to develop a vaccine and get everybody vaccinated. And then you wouldn't have an economic disaster. Well, exactly what I said would happen has happened. Now, the other thing you have to worry about now is that pandemics are random. And they're going to come from some animal source. We could have another pandemic this year. There's nothing prevents that. And we're still ill-equipped. And the problem is that the federal government and the non-scientist type of people think that if you need technology, you can develop it very quickly. You take a week or two. No. Developing a new technology can take 5 or 10, 20 years. And it depends on what kind of constraints you put on it. And what you want to do for something like a pandemic is what do we really need, not what do we already have. And what we want to do is keep it out of the country and also prevent it from escaping wherever it shows up. This is a world effort, not a national effort. So you should be testing everybody that leaves a country where the pandemic is, and you should test people again when they arrive in any other country. And that would really help it spread. It's going to spread mostly by people traveling by air. And it will spread very, very fast, as we have seen. Then the problem is, as the numbers go up, you'll start getting variants, which is now what we have. And you'll wind up maybe getting a variant that, in fact, the vaccine doesn't work against. Then we'll start all over. So this is a serious problem.
So do you think that the CDC and the NIH, or people in positions of power and influence, should have known or did know that if we were to have a pandemic, it could end up creating a cohort of people that never fully recovered?
I don't think so. I think ME/CFS has been swept under the rug for so long. And there are so many physicians that still think it's imaginary. And they think it's imaginary largely because they don't look sick unless they're bedridden, which they never see those patients because there's nobody doctors tend not to go to do house calls anymore. And then you do your standard functional test of liver function, kidney function, et cetera. Cholesterol levels, blood pressure, those are generally always all normal in most patients. So if I described my son, how bad he is. If you run all those standard tests that they do, he would look like, boy, he is in perfect health. Low cholesterol, low blood pressure, low blood sugar, he's fantastic. He must be an athlete. Yeah, he's bedbound. He can't even get out of bed hardly, right? So that's not the right test. You learn something from those tests, But you should understand that that doesn't test for everything that a person could have, and not blow them off because they come out positive. So then to come out looking like they're normal, they assume it must be imaginary, which is a really stupid decision, because I don't know of an imaginary disease, really.
Mm-hmm.
You should assume it's something that you don't know about and try to help the patients. So most patients have to visit maybe 10, 20 different doctors before they get a diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. And so is there a diagnostic test? And if not, what would you like to see happen to be able to create one?
Well, we do have one, but what we focused on first was to distinguish the patients from healthy. And if that test were out there, then, and they were positive in this test, then you could say, well, it's not imaginary. There's something wrong with these patients. And I now need to have the responsibility to figure out what it is. So that's something which is electronic. It's relatively simple to do. I think we can make it very cheap. It's called a nanoneedle, and it's basically where we take a blood cell, just take a blood sample, take the blood cell and put it on these little electrodes. It's all nanofabricated. It's very small. The electrode's about the size of a cell. And then you measure the electrical impedance if you stress the cells. So you stress the cells by adding some table salt, and they have to pump it out, and that stresses them. And you just wait, and the electrical impedance will increase. And that test works for every patient we've looked at. And it has not worked for anybody who is healthy. It's hard to get healthy people because you bring them in, they say they're healthy, and then you start testing. You get ready to test them, and they say, "Well, actually, I have MS, but I'm healthy," or "I have diabetes, but I'm healthy." So they have we don't want to have them have another known disease. And when we get healthy people with no known disease, they don't show this signal. It's pretty good. Most tests have false positive, false negative. We haven't seen that in this test. We've written several grants to scale that up and make it portable. They've all been turned down. This test has been published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And then still, they will not fund the development of it. This is just an example of not really thinking about technology. They think technology is something you turn on and in a few weeks you'll have it. No, it's hard and it takes a lot of time. We need to make a portable device that can do this, and we need to mass fabricate the nanoneedles. It'll be inexpensive if we do that, and it will be easily disseminated. Next problem would be, is it positive for other diseases? And that's a hard one because we have a really hard time getting the patients to come in that have another disease. They don't really see what's in it for them. And it could be that it is positive for other diseases, and that's okay. You just, when you try to diagnose something, you don't necessarily have a test that will tell you one test will tell you what the disease is. You basically group them. It's one way to do this. And it's like identifying a tree. Your first question is, do they have needles or leaves? And that splits them into about 2 different classes. And then you go from there. And then you can, pretty soon with a few tests, you can get it down to exactly, in the case, what tree it is or what disease it is.
So how are people currently diagnosed?
By symptoms. So they're fatigued, and they generally have to be fatigued for at least 6 months. And then one of the hallmarks of this is, which you can just ask somebody and they can give you the answer. What happens if you push yourself and you overdo it? Do you recover right away, or do you get worse for a while? Now you can actually test that by putting somebody on a bicycle and have them exercise heavily. And then you can have them come back in the next day or 2 days and try to do the exercise again. And they will not do it as well. If you take a congestive heart failure patient and do the same thing, these patients are about the same as a congestive heart failure patient in terms of what they can do. But a congestive heart failure patient can do the same level, low, but the same level they did before the first time, but not an ME/CFS patient. It's less. Now, the problem with that test, it's a little expensive, but the problem is that you could easily make the person worse. I mean, you will for the next day, but it's possible that they will not ever come back to where they were before. So I don't like doing a test or recommending a test that is potentially going to make them worse.
Interesting. So do you believe that people are genetically predisposed to developing ME/CFS? Are there genetic factors at play?
Well, we have found there are some things which I think can account for the symptoms, and not all. Some symptoms are only present in some of the patients. I think we've seen some of that. Some of the genes show that. We have a few that we're very suspicious of, and that we're following up on that. And one of the things to keep in mind is that ME/CFS can actually occur in epidemics of its own. In other words, there's a virus that comes through a community, and then there are a number of people who don't recover. And one of the classic ones was in Klein Village in the 80s. And Dan Peterson was the physician there. And he noticed that a lot of the patients that he saw the patients when they were sick. It's a small community. But then they would keep coming back. And they were not getting better, just exactly like the long COVID. And he had the CDC come out and do some testing, but they kind of blew him off and said it was probably imaginary. It was hysteria. One of the problems I think we have with this disease is that it seems to affect women more than men. And so I think that causes a lot of physicians to dismiss it, which I do not understand, but it seems to happen.
And so there's really ample research that your center's been able to do in collaboration with other great universities around the world as well, where you've shown that there's clear biological evidence of abnormalities. So yeah. What are those? Because I think that's one of the most important things that we can convey is that there are clear biological abnormalities.
Well, one of them is that you can look at the mitochondria, you can look at the small molecules that are within the mitochondria or the mitochondria produce it. The mitochondria are involved in making an awful lot of the small molecules that the body needs. And then that's because the mitochondria are where your energy is produced. That energy is a chemical called ATP, but that's where that all is produced. And if you look at the mitochondrial function and the concentrations of the critical components, they're low. And so, you can look at other small molecules in the body. And with my son, about a third of all the small molecules were more than 2 standard deviations away. Now, if you had measured some of those in your first test, you would clearly say there's something seriously wrong with them. And it's clear that the mitochondria are not functioning very well. They do not seem to burn glucose extremely well. And some patients, they don't burn fats extremely well. And in fact, what they seem to be burning mostly is amino acids, proteins. And that itself causes a potential problem because if you burn an amino acid, then amino acids have nitrogen in them, chemically bound up. And when you burn it, it's just like burning it in a flame. You wind up having to deal with the nitrogen, and you got to get rid of it. And you can get rid of it by making ammonia. And that's a problem because ammonia is toxic. And so we're looking into that. Well, that's a major effort. We've written several grants on that. They've all been turned down. We've been working with a little startup company here in Palo Alto that has a handheld ammonia detecting system, which we're going to try to put into place. we're looking at the patients to see if they're producing a lot of ammonia.
Interesting. So if you had to just describe ME/CFS then simply for people, which there's so many things that are clearly wrong, it's hard for people to get out and explain, this is what I have. So how would you describe?
I would call it really a systemic illness. That is, it affects a lot of functions. If you have a hard time with somebody, what do you mean by that? You might just say, my cells cannot really produce energy. They've been blocked in some way or other. Now, that's not all that's going on, but that would help people understand why you have a hard time getting out of bed and why you can't work a full day. And that, I think you want to explain that to other people so that they have some basis for understanding it. Keeping in mind that the brain uses a lot of energy when it's thinking. It would be good for more people to think more.
I was going to say.
But you don't think as well, and they often call it brain fog. And so, and you're slower at thinking. You can test that. That's actually one of the tests you can do. That is one of the hallmarks of the disease. Do you have brain fog or do you have slow functioning? And you can test them for that. It's easy. So that would also explain maybe why sometimes the patients seem a little nutty, right? Because I think it has affected the brain because the brain's not having enough energy production. And so don't blame them. They have a disease and it's affecting their brain. It's not affecting everybody in the same way, but it does affect some of the patients. And so some of them are fearful and so forth, and it's okay. It's just part of the disease. Don't blame them.
So do you think that at this point in time, just maybe having public pressure would help to open the floodgates for some of this funding from the government? If you really need substantial long-term funding, what could help with that?
Well, I think so. And I think one of the problems is the fact that almost all of the patients have been told that there's nothing wrong with them at some point. And sometimes they do learn what they have, and they do their own reading and research and so forth. But there's such a large fraction of patients that have not been diagnosed with this disease. They have it and they don't know it. And that's because physicians don't know enough, and the patients think the doctors know everything. So if they don't know what's wrong with me, there's nobody that knows what's wrong with me. And that's a problem. But I think reaching out to your local representative and senators, and hopefully NIH will not continue this saying, oh, no, we're doing plenty of stuff. We're doing a lot of stuff. And they're not. There's a lot of people who have this, and there's going to be a lot more. They got to do more. And they've got to do some. The problem is also in the reviews, the scientific reviews. We don't know enough about this disease. How do you write a good grant? How do you have a good hypothesis when you don't know anything? Hypotheses come from data. So we take all of our data and post it on a website that any scientist can access. Patients can't, because we don't want them to be experimenting on themselves. But scientists can look at it, and that will help maybe for other people to get hypotheses, so they don't have to do the same experiments that we've done.
So would you like to be able to track these COVID long haulers, as they're termed, long-term then, just longitudinally, to get data? And
absolutely, and that's one of the projects that AME has been doing, writing some simple apps. They've got to be simple because the patients don't have a lot of energy. And so we can't expect them to do a lot. So it's got to make it really simple, just the kind of data that we need and nothing more. And we'd like to follow them and what's happening with them.
That would be ideal.
Yeah. And it would be also good to see the patients, how many patients are getting over it. My suspicions are with this disease that it gets triggered early, and there is probably a good chance that you will get over it in the first year or two. but and maybe quite a few in the first 6 months. But the longer you go with it, it looks like the lower the probability you'll get over it. So we'd like to see, and we'd like to have data. What goes wrong at the very beginning when you have this disease? And what starts to change as you start get the few people that do get over it? What changes? And those may allow us to get some good ideas about how we can do treatment or trigger them to get over it.
This is really fascinating. So really in an age where we're all interconnected with technology so much, this should be a prime opportunity for us to study people even before, during or after they convert to ME/CFS.
Yeah, and we are trying to work on sort of various remote ways to do things as well. So a lot of the new technologies, in fact, we're working with Mike Snyder on this. You can take and analyze an awful lot of things from a blood spot. So normal doctors take 5 or 10 mils of blood. You can take a finger stick and put a drop of blood on a piece of paper and let it dry and mail it to us, for example. And we're trying to put the technology together to do that. What we can do in that is to see, do you have any viruses? And we're setting up, because it's possible that they have some virus that got activated or they got a second infection and they're not getting over that one. And that may be a problem. So we're setting up assays for almost all the major DNA viruses, all the major RNA viruses, all the parasites, all the bacteria, and all the funguses. And we can do that from one blood spot. And then in addition to that, we can look at all the small molecules.
That's really amazing. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, Dr. Davis, and for your passion on this.
Well, and we have a lot of hypotheses on what's going wrong, but we have a limited capacity we just have to pick and choose which one we look at. So we're trying to let the genetics tell us which ones probably are the best ones to look at, but we have to put on the shelf all the others because we don't have enough money, our people, to study them.
Well, I think it's time for a change. So thank you for all of the work you've done.
Thank you.
Leading up to this.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And actually, this is a perfect segue as well to your colleague, Dr. Snyder, talking about technology and how to really track people long term and how you've all been working together on this. So I'll give a quick little intro. Dr. Snyder is the Stanford W. Asherman Professor and Chair, Department of Genetics, and Director of the Center for Genomics and Personalized Medicine in the Stanford School of Medicine, is a world-leading expert in genomics, personalized molecular profiling, and precision medicine. Dr. Snyder's lab has been a pioneering force in the field of precision medicine, including establishing many foundational methods in the field of genomics. Dr. Snyder was the first to apply personalized health tracking using multiomics in coordination with wearable devices to predict and prevent disease. So, Dr. Snyder, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you for your patience. So, what do you do?
Well, we're all about big data. Our expertise is in using big data to better manage people's health, try and diagnose disease early, and to be honest, treat disease in the most precise and personal way possible. So what we do is we actually sample people that take their blood, we'll take their urine and even their poop, and we'll do these very, very detailed molecular measurements on them to try and understand better what's going on, when they're healthy, to see what their, we call it, health state looks like, but also trying to understand disease as well. So in the case of chronic fatigue syndrome, we're very, very interested in trying to understand better what's going on. Ron mentioned some of the things going on. People's metabolism seems to be off. A lot of their molecular measurements are off. We're trying to take this to a depth people haven't really looked at before. So we had not only profile people very, very deeply, we also try to follow them over time to see how they shift, see what things correlate with these crash days Ron mentioned, as well as the good days. So by doing these very detailed molecular measurements, we hope to be able to better understand, again, what's going on with their disease. So we might see, for example, that some of their immune system might be off a bit, or their metabolic states. Try and better understand the molecular pathways that are going on. by taking all these big data measurements, as they call them, we hope to be able to better do that.
Fascinating. So what are omics? What is omics research?
Yeah,
For people who don't know.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so genome means your DNA, your genes. Your transcriptome is actually your RNA, your proteomes, your proteins. And these omes collectively, they refer to all the molecules, if you will. And when we sample, for example, your blood, we'll try and sample as many molecules as possible. We'll literally sample 20,000 molecules out of people's blood. And we'll do that again over time. And we'll do the same thing out of urine. And out of people's poop, we actually follow something called the microbiome. It's believe it or not, there are more cells in you that aren't you. They're actually bacteria that sit in your gut, but they're very, very critical for your health. They actually they digest your food. They make essential vitamins. They're very, very critical for your health. And so by making all these measurements, we hope to better, again, understand people's health state. It's pretty clear people are shifted when they get ill. All diseases have these molecular changes associated with them, and even these microbiome changes have been associated with pretty much every disease. And what's special about chronic fatigue syndrome is that it's really not clear what's going on. As both Ami and Ron had said, we really don't understand it very well. And so the hope is by making these very detailed measurements, we will better understand it. Is it 10 diseases? Is it 100 diseases? And we may be able to stratify it. There's no question there's common underlying elements, but there may be also some differences. And maybe by understanding that, we could say, well, this person will respond to treatment X and that person to treatment Y. So step one is to do these detailed measurements, as Ron was saying, both to get quantitative measurements to show somebody has a disease in the first place, but then we hope that information will also better help manage and treat disease as well.
So is this an opportunity to use wearables on patients to track them?
So we do these detailed measurements. Ron mentioned how we're doing this microsampling where we prick people's fingers and we can follow them over time. And we're developing very, very deep, they're called profiling technologies, where we'll make lots of measurements. But on top of that, we do these wearable measurements, smartwatches. So I wear these. I'm not only
you're on QVC right now.
Oh, you're wasting the opportunity for collecting valuable data. Believe it or not, we can tell when you get COVID-19 from your smartwatch, and you'll see it days before symptoms, an average of 4 days before symptoms. So we think this is very, very powerful. These things are measuring you 24/7, and they're taking literally hundreds of thousands of measurements every day. So you can follow someone's physiology very, very well from a smartwatch. And there's new devices, they make measurements that commonly aren't even used in the doctor's office. For example, they'll measure conductance on your skin, something that I know interests some of the tests that Ron runs for chronic fatigue syndrome patients. So, and Ami, I should say. So there are tests that don't exist in the doctor's office, but they actually tease out new parameters that nobody's thought about. And they actually show up in certain diseases, like that measurement I just mentioned actually does have some signature for type 2 diabetes, believe it or not. So we think that these kinds of technologies, they haven't been explored in this area. We think they'll be very, very powerful for trying to explore disease. And then you combine the so-called wearable physiological measurements on top of these molecular measurements, these omics measurements you referred to. And we think they're just powerful ways of trying to follow the disease. The other aspect of this is by collecting people's big data, if you will, we can build, we think, personalized management systems for people. So we're using something called artificial intelligence. Take all this data and try and predict what leads to crash days versus good days so that you can avoid the crash days and better learn the good days. And we're doing this in certain areas. We actually have an ME CFS study out there. Please sign up with wearables and microsampling. And again, it's in collaboration with Ron and Ami. And we're trying to actually do just that, collect this data with the goal of trying at a personal level for an individual, be able to make this management tool. And we have it all set up so you pull in all the data right from a smartphone. It shows it up on a dashboard. And once we run our training algorithms on it, we might be able to say, remember how Ron said if you exercise too hard, that can cause you to crash. We'd like to know what that number is. And we can measure that, believe it or not, with wearables. We know exactly how much exercise you're exerting at any one time. So these are the kinds of, and then you can use, again, this artificial intelligence to say, this amount of exercise is going to cause you to crash, but this amount's going to be healthy for you. That's the goal, we hope. And so we want to do it at a personal level, because I predict it'll be a little bit different for person A versus person B. We want to make sure we get it just right for every person.
Wow. And so you're currently recruiting for people to participate in that study?
We are, yep. So go to the Genome Technology website. You can come to ours, innovation.stanford.edu. Any of these will lead you to the same place. We'd love to have you enroll.
That's really amazing. And so when would you want to see people also who have COVID participate in something like that? What are you doing with COVID right now as well?
Yeah, we have a lot going on with COVID. So we are enrolling people with COVID actually in general, because we're trying to actually detect disease early. And I'll back up a little bit. Believe it or not, I actually got a chronic illness from a viral infection. So you may not realize it, but I'm type 2 diabetic. And my genome actually predicted I was at risk for this. But I was perfectly healthy. But after a very nasty virus called respiratory syncytial virus, it's actually kind of common, not unlike COVID is now, I suppose, although it's not as nasty as COVID. But anyway, 3 weeks after that, my glucose shot through the roof and I became chronically ill. I became type 2 diabetic. I was able initially to get under control, but it did come back. So we really do believe everything you've heard already in this segment, that viruses do trigger chronic illnesses. It just hasn't been explored. It's already known for type 1 diabetes, not known very well how. Another one of these big mysteries. What happens when you get a virus, does it? And it's also known that chronic fatigue syndrome is associated with infections, again, in some nebulous fashion. We don't really understand how this whole thing works. In my case, I got type 2 diabetes. And believe it or not, it associates with changes in my DNA, something called epigenetics. That's a whole separate story. But that's the point. You can actually, these viruses do have long-term effects. So we have no idea what's going to come out of COVID. It's pretty clear type 2 diabetes is going to be one. And as Ron and Ami says, there's no question chronic fatigue syndrome is going to be huge out of this. And so we need to measure it. And these devices, so we are, believe it or not, we're trying to roll a study to get 10 million people all signed up. We can actually pull in their data in real time and ping them back when their resting heart rate jumps up, which is associated with a viral infection. And so we're triggering that. We can catch disease early, but we're also discovering that people who've had COVID have these signals that actually track on for months after they've had COVID. You can actually see if the resting heart rate has been running abnormally high, and it runs much higher than before they had COVID. So it's these long-lasting effects that Ami and Ron were talking about. They're real. They exist. Now, we don't know if they'll go away 6 months. It's still early, or a year from now. We'll find that out. But you can only find that out by tracking them all the time. And these wearable devices, again, are just super powerful for doing just that.
Wow, that's amazing. So what kind of resources do you need in order to have a collaborative trial like that, or a big study?
Number one is people. Just sign up. All you have to do is download the app. Go to innovations.stanford.edu. We work closely with the technology center you just heard about. We won't complain if you give us more funding. Unlike Ron, I'm happy to take gifts through all this. Do send it to the Genome Technology Center. I think they can be very powerful, because what Ron says is absolutely true, that the NIH, the common funding mechanism, they're just slow. They're like oil tankers. They just can't move very quickly. But what's powerful about donations is that they actually have immediate impact. And so, if you are able to contribute resources, I'm not saying you have to, sign up for a study. That's number one. But number two, if you have the resource and want to contribute, I think they can go a long ways to helping the kinds of research that Ron was describing, the kinds of research that we do. We work together on all this stuff. So it's really, and I will say, it does take a team effort to solve a complicated problem like this.
Wow, that is so powerful. I am so incredibly impressed. I'm just sitting here as an observer right now, listening to all of you. And so,
by the way, now you know why I don't like the fact that you're not wearing watches. You're missing valuable data.
Oh, I got to go get mine. I have them. They're just not on me ever. So I
Okay.
need to fix that problem. These are really amazing. So do you have any really important fundamental scientific question just on your mind right now around, ME, COVID, or just these big fundamental questions that you're seeking? Is there anything you're really trying to ascertain?
Well, my own guess is that there are these what are called epigenetic effects, that there are these long-lasting effects. And it may be modifications in your DNA. It may be modifications in this microbiome I mentioned earlier and other things. So the thing about our bodies is they're really complex systems. They're integrated systems. Just think about a rocket ship. It has a lot of integrated systems, but a human body is even 10 times more complex than that. And these systems all have to work together or you blow up or you never get off the landing pad. And so I think it's important to understand how all the different components work together. And that's why we're big fans of big data. We want the data to tell us how the whole thing works. What's going wrong then, like in cases like this, and a complicated disease like CFS, there's clearly something going wrong. And it's probably, you'll see all the different parts going off. But I think we need to understand that to understand why there's systems failure. And I think that's one way I hope that we'll be able to, treat people and get them out of the systems failure, and hopefully they'll lead healthy, happy lives.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation too, because I think a lot of people who are affected or who just want to contribute to science in general, now they know one thing they can do. How they can enroll, they can be a participant, and they can donate, they can be a voice for people. There are really a lot of ways that they can get engaged and help, and I think letting them feel that they have a power to do that is really wonderful. So
Totally agree. Yeah.
So in closing, I would like to thank everyone who participated today on this panel. It's been so informative. And I'd like to throw it back to Dr. Ami Mack and see if there's anything you would like to recap and provide as kind of a last bit of leaving advice for our audience.
Now, Ron's son is extremely severe, but there are some of us that are walking around that just wonder, I don't know, I just don't feel the way I did last year. And you may have a milder case. So there's a variety of severities. As I said before, 75 to 80% at some point find themselves to be homebound and bedbound. And so the severity can also fluctuate in its course. So many of the patients that I see, one moment can seem perfectly fine to you because they maybe didn't push themselves for the last week or weren't able to go to work. And then the moment they're talking to you, they seem okay. And then 2 hours later, they're completely debilitated and can't get off the bed, or they can't think straight. So I have people like attorneys who need to be able to speak in public and think clearly, who can't work anymore, but they don't get the respect for having this that they deserve, because there's nobody who sees them at those moments. They don't go to the doctor when they can't get out of bed or can't speak. So it's really important to understand Epstein-Barr virus or EBV, HHV6, CMV. There are so many viruses, coronaviruses in general, viruses in the herpes family category. Now, when I say herpes family, it's not necessarily, certain ones versus another. There's a lot of viruses that under a microscope look the same, but they may not be the same exact virus. So that's also when you hear SARS-CoV-2, it looks similar to SARS-1, which is why we call it SARS-2. So they're in the same family, and many of these viruses are implicated. It's not something that's new in the medical world. HHV6 has been shown to go to the thyroid. EBV has been shown to cause or be something that predisposes people to cancer, like Burkitt's lymphoma. This is not new to us. And as Mike spoke about, after he had RSV, he developed diabetes type 2. So we know that viruses can cause chronic long-term conditions. Now, what's brought all of this to the attention of scientists and physicians more recently It's a shame that we have not studied this to the full potential that we could have before. But what's really important to know is that right now we have a great opportunity. It's a sad reason to really focus on this. It's sad that 108 million people across the globe have this. But we have to utilize this and turn something positive and get something positive out of this, which is take COVID and all the people that are studied and watch and study and have them wear wearables and use technology to its full potential so that this no longer happens and we can have diagnostics and treatments for people who are suffering from this, who before never really had much attention and help. So if there's 108 million people with COVID, if even 10% of them develop ME/CFS, which is a very conservative estimation on our part, that's 10.8 million people worldwide. And what about those that never even had a positive test? Who's going to validate them? So one really important point in all of this is, Mike talked about type 2 diabetes. 200 years ago, before we had some test where we could measure blood sugar, diabetics were considered maybe crazy too, or looked at as though they were strange and it didn't make sense. They came in first, maybe just having stomach pain or urinating a lot or very thirsty all the time. But then eventually they required amputations and their vision went and they became blind. Similarly, MS. People were thrown into mental institutions who had MS. And it wasn't until the MRI was discovered that we could see plaques in patients' spinal cords and brains. And we said, oh, wow, there is something happening. So what's really important to understand is that diagnosis follows technology. And the current tests that the physicians have to pick up ME/CFS don't show anything because that's all they have access to. We in these robust laboratories at Stanford and all these other universities have tools that we either have right now or that we're creating so that we can someday diagnose people with a test. It's very important for the number of people that are affected by these post-viral syndromes that we pursue this. And if we don't, all of the people who are suffering, like those who are suffering with ME/CFS for so long, are going to feel invalidated and are going to feel not recognized. And at this time, Ron, Mike, myself, you, thank you, because you are helping us to find an outlet to be a voice for all those people that don't have a voice for themselves. Many of us at times in our lives have not had a voice. People haven't listened, whether it meant we wanted to go to a certain school or, we had an idea and we needed someone to support us and advocate for us. So we are here as a group to advocate for those people that are suffering with no voice and no way to go about doing it. And I urge the entire community here listening, the global community, to please, even if you're healthy, use your voice. Use what you've learned today so that those people who can't fight for themselves have people to support them and fight on their behalf. Now, back when I was in medical school, we had to learn things quickly, but we couldn't even have imagined how quickly research develops there's new studies and new research, and it's impossible for us at this point as physicians to read all of that and keep up. So right now, medical knowledge doubles every 73 days. What doctor can keep up with all of that? And that's why at Stanford, we're using innovation and technology computers, artificial intelligence, wearables, sensors. We're taking the best of technology and applying it to these huge problems. And we have a very big global problem ahead of us. We're looking at why people are dying now, but we also have to be very much attuned to what's going to happen later. And that is a population of people who are going to be disabled and not be able to contribute to society, their friends and their lives. And how are we going to take care of them? So I really urge everyone to use their voice. And please, for those people who are in public health or in the government or other scientists and physicians, please use us as a resource and reach out to us. And thank you to the people of Bari. We're so happy to have the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Dr. Mack. You know, science and advocacy really go hand in hand, and we can't do any of that important work without the public. So public pressure can mount significant change in the world. We've seen it before, and I'm hopeful that we will see it again with this. And for everyone in the meantime to stay positive and optimistic. And if we work together, we can achieve great things. So thank you. Signing off from California.
Chesley, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.